Thank you so much, Kelsey, and welcome everyone. So let's go to our first speaker, which is Zachary Patterson. A little bit about Zach. Zach is a third-year PhD student at Carnegie Mellon in the Soft Machines Lab, working on bio-inspired and soft-bodied robots. Specifically, his research is focused on using his robots as platforms for learning more about the mechanics of animal locomotion and locomotion in general. And when he's not in the lab building his rubber and beautiful robots, he likes playing jazz piano, playing basketball, and reading. And with that, let's move to Zachary's presentation. Zach, the floor is all yours.
Great, thanks for that lovely introduction. Let me go ahead and share my screen. Okay. All right, can we see it?
Yes.
I can't see anyone. Okay, thank you. All right, so today I'll be talking about biomimetic approaches to robot design. So let's go ahead and get started. So before I get into the meat of the presentation, I should address why we want biomimetic machines. After all, if we look at the human engineered solutions that we see to the left of the slide, in many ways, they outperform the natural world drastically. One answer to this question of why biomimetic then, at a high level, is that organisms have evolved to deal with a variety of unstructured, uncertain, and rapidly changing environments. Whereas our human solutions largely are constrained to somewhat or highly structured environments. Think of, for example, a train constrained to the tracks. We're still quite bad at getting our machines to work when we can't control what's going on around them. With the perpetually 5 years away self-driving cars being kind of a case in point here. So if we want to take the next step and put machines into more unpredictable environments, then a fruitful approach is to look to biology and take advantage of the problem solving performed by evolution. So the machines on the right side of the screen here are all heavily inspired by biology and are clearly designed to overcome difficult environments. And you can kind of see, just based on the slides, the types of environments that these robots are designed to function in are much different from, say, the industrial robots or a drone or a car. We can also provide another answer to this question, and the reason I bring this up will become clear later. This answer is provided by a community of researchers that call their work robophysics. Some famous names in this group are like Dan Goldman at Georgia Tech, Howie Choset at CMU. Their argument is that by building robots based on animals, we can learn more about the animals and their behavior, and also about the fundamental mechanics of locomotion, especially in challenging environments. And then we can in turn use that knowledge to improve our robots. And so we engage in this sort of fruitful feedback loop of knowledge between the two types of systems. We have a problem though, and that's that unstructured environments are difficult. And so this is a pretty famous little blooper reel of some robots at the DARPA Robotics Challenge a few years ago, just utterly failing at whatever they were trying to do. And so why do these robots fail? Like any complex question, there's a lot of answers here, but I'd like to focus on the lack of compliant or deformable structures. So when we look at the animal kingdom, we see compliant structures and soft materials everywhere, from the muscles that exist in every creature to the flexible spring-like cheetah spine to the fully soft-bodied octopus. However, most of our machines primarily use stiff structures made out of metal and other rigid materials because it's easier to predict and control their behavior. So what do we lose with this approach? Well, deformable structures, when encountering unexpected disturbances, will deform rather than crash or destroy whatever it is they're in contact with. From the perspective of a roboticist, this means less computation is necessary to reliably interact with the environment. The structure itself deals with the things we haven't predicted, and this concept is commonly referred to as morphological intelligence. I'd like to particularly highlight this GIF of the octopus squeezing itself out of a glass bottle. Because octopuses are fully soft-bodied, they can accomplish tasks like this that would be extremely difficult or even impossible for creatures with more rigid structures. This video is kind of like the muse of a sub-community of roboticists calling themselves soft roboticists. And inspired by this type of functionality, researchers like me seek to develop mostly or fully soft-bodied robots to accomplish tasks that would be impossible for rigid robots. So because they lack skeletons, when we look at soft-bodied organisms larger than, say, a caterpillar, like the octopus or the jellyfish or the giant squid, we see they primarily exist in the ocean because the buoyant force obviates the need for the skeletal structure to support their large bodies. So it's in this environment that soft robotics people often choose to develop robots larger than, say, like millimeter scale. And so I will now introduce the model organism for my robot. It's the brittle star. I should first talk about why I'm building a brittle star robot. After all, I could have chosen maybe a more superficially interesting animal as an inspiration. First of all, it's underwater, and I just covered why that might be advantageous. It's also omnidirectional, and we'll see a video of the animal moving on the next slide, so you'll hopefully get a better sense of what I mean by that. But basically, it's able to change directions without actually turning, which allows for more rapid and energy efficient changes in direction. The brittle star is also highly flexible, making it conducive to design with soft materials. They're also surprisingly fast, which is great. We want fast robots. And finally, they're highly versatile. They can crawl with multiple gaits, they can climb, they can grasp, and they can even actually swim, thanks to this, which we know thanks to this amazing video that was captured by a submarine a few years ago. And so just to talk a little bit about brittle stars, their scientific name is ophiuroid, and they're echinoderms that are closely related to the type of the sea stars that we think of typically when we think of starfish. They're a highly successful class. They live in most regions of the ocean, from the Arctic to the equator and from the coast to the trenches. They can vary in diameter from a few millimeters up to like 60 centimeters. And most brittle stars have 5 limbs arranged in a pentaradially symmetric configuration. These limbs have a calcium carbonate skeleton formed by structures called vertebral ossicles, which are actuated by longitudinal muscles running through the arms. So you can see the muscles here embedded inside the central ossicle. The limbs are highly flexible, and the animal uses them to pull itself along the seafloor, as you can see in the video. And so to build a brittle star robot, I took design ideas both from the brittle star itself, but also from work by Walters and McGoran in their 2011 paper. They constructed this planar bending actuator using shape memory alloy wire as sort of an artificial muscle. This is a type of actuator that's relatively soft. And so they embedded this artificial muscle into this beam-like structure to create this bending actuator. And so what I did was adapt this design and basically, instead of using 2 SMA shape memory alloy artificial muscles, I used 4 arranged in quadrants like we see here on the brittle star cross section to allow for out of plane bending as opposed to the planar bending actuator that they designed. And so after making this design choice, you can see a cross section of my brittle star limbs here with 4 SMA coils as the artificial muscle. And then we have this video here that shows us that indeed this allows for out of plane bending. You'll notice that the limb bends preferentially along the major axis of the ellipsoid. which was a choice motivated by the brittle star morphology, as the vertebral ossicles of the brittle star constrain the out-of-plane motion of brittle star limbs. And so these notches you see in the sides of the limbs are what allows for that sort of preferential deformation in that direction. And so I connect 5 of these arms to a central disk containing the electronics to produce our brittle star robot, which we call Patrick. I'd just like to highlight the SMA coils, which you can see running through the limbs, just because you haven't actually seen a real picture of them yet. So this is what they look like. And those, again, are the actual actuator that causes this thing to move. The robot's fully untethered, meaning that it has its own computing and power sources on board. And so the power source you see here, it's just an off-the-shelf drone battery. And we're communicating with the robot through a Bluetooth antenna that's hooked up to its microcontroller. So how do we make this robot move? Well, we again look to the brittle star to determine a gait. Brittle stars move themselves with what is called a rowing gait, which means after they choose a forward direction, they use the limb to either side of the leading limb, is the technical term, to pull themselves forward in a sort of a rowing motion, like think of a rowboat. We programmed a sequence of actuations into Patrick that are tuned to mimic this gait. And we refer to this sequence of actuations using the parlance of sort of planning over motion primitives as a motion primitive. Once we did that, we had to implement a controller to determine which limb is the front, or to determine which motion primitive to execute equivalently. To do that, we simply algorithmically choose the direction that minimizes the predicted distance to our desired target. So this results in behavior that's very similar to the animal, as instead of turning its body, the robot will simply choose a new limb to lead. And so we'll see that coming up here on the next slide, where we'll see an actual video of the robot. And so with my collaborators, we put all this together. And we told the robot to chase after this gold ball. And so you see the robot getting itself over there, kind of using this rowing-like gait, similar to the brittle star. You also notice the uncertainty in the robot's motion. These motion primitives are highly variable, which could have been a problem. But it's still able to get to the goal because of our simple control scheme, as well as the sort of morphological intelligence concept that I referred to earlier, which means that the soft structures that we're using to build the robot allow the robot to overcome a high amount of uncertainty, basically by being robust to that uncertainty. Okay. And so now I'll address what we're doing with this robot currently. If you recall from the intro, I mentioned this approach to robotics where we use biomimetic robots to learn more about animals and vice versa. I find this approach very compelling, and much of my current and future work involves using Patrick to do this. And so as a first research agenda, along with my collaborator, Dr. Henry Astley at Akron, he's a biologist, we noticed that a big difference between Patrick and the brittle star is the distribution of mass. So on Patrick, because of the battery, the bulk of the mass is concentrated at the center of the robot, whereas for the brittle star, the mass is more evenly distributed, or possibly even more concentrated on the arms. And so this leads to our research question, which is the density and mass distribution an important principle for brittle star underwater walking? And the hypothesis is that by evening out the density distribution, by spreading mass out towards the limbs, will cause the robot to move faster or more efficiently. And so here's sort of an experimental plan to test this hypothesis. We have 3 weight classes, a baseline case, a case with added mass, and then a case where we double the added mass. And within each of these added mass cases, we have 3 separate test cases, one in which the mass is added to the center, one in which the mass is added to the proximal half of the arms, and then one in which the mass is added to the distal half of the arms. And so we needed a way to add mass. This is just a bit of engineering, but I think it's pretty interesting and gives you a good taste of some other things that we do in our lab besides biomimetics. We needed to add this mass, and so I decided to use a material that we commonly use called eutectic gallium indium, which is a special metal compound that's liquid at room temperature. And so we can form liquid metal elastomer composites by mixing this into uncured silicone and use it to form a heavier composite than plain old silicone, critically without significantly altering the mechanical properties of the final material, which basically means that the limbs will still have roughly the same stiffness. And so I created these composites and molded them into the Patrick limbs. And so that's how kind of we accomplished this mass distribution. And so you see the sort of 3 robots over on the right side of the screen here. Typically, eGain, eutectic gallium indium, we call it eGain, is not used in this way. It's more often used for its electrical or thermal conductivity in silicone composites to make flexible electronics and things like that. But it was a perfect way to do what we wanted to do here. And so here's a couple experiments that I ran. On the top, we see the center case, which cannot move. And on the bottom, we see the proximal case, which does move. And so the results here, and this is the 42.5 grams added case. And so the results here are in support of our hypothesis, and we still need to finish out the experiments here. But this is kind of an example of this biomimetic approach. And then our collaborator will be performing experiments, or actually just, he'll basically be dismembering brittle stars and finding the density distribution of the actual animals so that we can compare. So shifting gears a bit, it's fair to say that Patrick does replicate some salient aspects of brittle star morphology and locomotion, but we can do better. In particular, we can create limbs that are more similar to the brittle star morphology, and hopefully that allows the robot to be even more biomimetic in its function. And so to do this, I'm collaborating with Laura Tummel at Harvard. Laura published this amazing work where she performed 3D scans of brittle star limbs. And now we're using her previous work to produce realistic brittle star arms based on the actual morphology of the animal. And so for my version of the limb, I'm embedding 4 SMA actuators into the limb as before. Only now, because we have this more biomimetic structure, we hopefully get more biomimetic function. And so here again is a preliminary result of the functionality of the limb. And I mean, we can't really take away too much from this slide. Also, apologies for the sort of lab quality video. But I am happy with this because qualitatively it looks to me like more like the brittle star motion, but I won't know for sure until I put 5 of them on a robot and see what happens. And so that's the next step here. And then finally, as I mentioned towards the beginning of the talk, brittle stars have an immense amount of variation in size. That's clear from these images as we see the species on the left called the green brittle star is bigger than 2 human hands. It's like almost creepy how large this thing is. In the middle, the brittle star fits nicely into the human palm. And then we see on the right, the brittle stars are smaller than a human fingernail. And so I wanted to see if we could scale this platform downwards like the biological system. And so in collaboration with Dinesh Patel, a postdoc at CMU, I built a robot that is a scaled down version of Patrick to 50% size. The other thing that makes this robot special is that aside from the electronics and the shape memory alloy, it's entirely 3D printed, since that's Dinesh's specialty, printing soft and flexible materials. This streamlines the manufacturing process and opens up the possibility of building even smaller robots that would be more difficult to injection mold, using the processes that I typically use to build my robots. And so here's a preliminary result of the robot moving. I'm currently working on applying feedback control to the robot in the coming week or two, and we'll submit this work to IROS coming up, which is a robotics conference. But here you can see the robot moving itself, albeit very slowly because it's much smaller. And so that's about it. I'd like to thank my collaborators, my lab, the Soft Machines Lab at Carnegie Mellon, and my advisor, Carmel, and my funders. And so thank you everyone for listening to my talk, and we'll open the floor up for questions now.